Imagine scrolling through Instagram, right? And you see a candid photo of a married couple posing on a bridge.
Pretty standard stuff.
Exactly. The husband has his arm around his wife, and playfully, he's resting his hand on her breast. It's an affectionate, completely normal post for a married couple. But this specific photo sparked an intense, honestly kind of shocking public reaction.
Because of who posted it.
Right. The woman in the photo was actress Candace Cameron Bure. She posted this picture with her husband of 24 years, and almost immediately, just a massive wave of backlash flooded her comments. Fans were telling her the photo was inappropriate for a Christian, demanding she present herself, more modestly.
It's a really striking moment. It forces us to look at the public reaction to a married couple just displaying basic physical affection.
Yeah.
But what makes this incident so relevant for you, the listener today, is how Candace chose to respond to that backlash.
Yeah.
And what that response reveals about the deeply ingrained messages we carry with us.
Because she fiercely defended the post. She came right out and said, look, flirting and having fun together is exactly what makes a 24-year marriage work. She argued physical intimacy should be celebrated within a marriage.
All right, which makes sense.
But in doing so, she shared something incredibly vulnerable. She revealed that for years after getting married, she actually struggled with severe shame around sex.
Oh.
She talked about how in those early years of marriage, she was constantly worrying, thinking, is God looking at me and is this bad? Even with a wedding ring on her finger, she couldn't escape that deep fear. Her body and her mind were essentially at war.
Which brings us perfectly to the heart of what we are exploring with you today. We are looking at a system of beliefs that wires the brain so thoroughly that a wedding ceremony alone cannot undo the conditioning.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We have a really fascinating stack of sources to go through with you today. We are looking at entertainment news articles detailing this whole story, excerpts from the Candace Cameron Bure podcast, and a remarkably comprehensive 2022 UT Austin dissertation by researcher Aaron N. Benton.
Our mission today is to thoroughly unpack the phenomenon known as purity culture. We're going to examine its historical roots, decode its psychological mechanics, and discover how the messages we absorb about intimacy in our youth can profoundly shape our adult lives, relationships, and mental health long after we've grown up.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with Candace's revelation about what she called the shame culture. She had done everything by the book according to the culture she grew up in. She abstained from sex before marriage.
Right, she followed all the rules.
But she found out the hard way that you can't just flip a switch and turn off the guilt the moment you say, I do. She lived in such fear of being a sexual person that her nervous system literally didn't know how to adjust to this new reality where intimacy was suddenly supposed to be a good, celebrated thing.
And that inability to just flip the switch, that is a profound psychological hurdle. Framing it as a nervous system response, it's exactly the right way to look at it. It's something she discussed quite candidly on her own podcast, specifically in her conversations with Madison Prewitt-Trout.
Yeah, those episodes were really revealing.
They attempt to reframe the concept of purity entirely. They discuss moving away from the idea of purity as a rigid list of rules rooted in fear, reputation, and public perception. Instead, they try to view it as a personal path to spiritual freedom, completely divorced from that intense, paralyzing shame.
And the analogies they use on the podcast to describe this psychological conditioning are incredibly vivid. They talk about the impact of these teachings being like an unseen gas leak in a home.
That's a great way to put it. Think about the mechanics of a gas leak. It's silent, it's invisible, and you often have no idea it's happening until the damage is severe or even catastrophic.
Yeah.
They use this to explain how hidden, unexamined beliefs from our past can slowly, quietly drain a person's spiritual and mental health over time. You might be walking around as a fully functioning adult, successful in your career, perhaps even married.
Doing totally fine on paper.
Exactly. Completely unaware that these deep-seated messages about shame and bodily autonomy are silently toxifying your well-being. By the time you smell the gas, so to speak, you're already suffocating in your own relationships.
Building on that, they brought up another analogy that really highlights the disconnect between the intent of these teachings and their actual impact. They use the lifeguard analogy.
Right.
Imagine you're at the beach, and the lifeguard puts up double red flags, blowing their whistle, pleading with everyone to get out of the water. The point made on the podcast is that the lifeguard isn't doing this to ruin your fun or control your vacation. They're doing it to save your life from a rip current you can't see.
And understanding that intention is crucial for our analysis today. The Architects of purity culture, the parents, the youth pastors, the community leaders enforcing these rules, they genuinely believed they were the lifeguards.
They thought they were helping.
They thought they were throwing out a life preserver to protect young people from severe emotional and physical harm. We have to contrast what was intended with the sociological and historical data showing how those intended protections actually played out. What's fascinating here is how the sociological and historical data shows us exactly how those intended protections played out in reality.
Yeah.
And to understand that gap between intention and reality, we have to look at the historical origins.
Let's bring in the academic source for this, the UT Austin dissertation. It traces the modern purity culture movement back to a very specific moment in the cultural landscape, the 1990s in the United States.
It's a very turbulent time.
Very. If you recall what was happening in the country back then, the U.S. was facing the peak of the AIDS epidemic. The research notes a really sobering statistic. AIDS was the leading cause of death for men aged 25 to 44 at the time.
Wow.
Simultaneously, teen pregnancy rates had hit an all-time high. There was a palpable nationwide cultural panic regarding sexual health and mortality.
And the evangelical community responded to that sheer panic in 1992 with an institutional program called True Love Waits.
Right.
It started as a localized youth ministry initiative, but quickly exploded into a massive cultural phenomenon. By 1994, there was a highly publicized rally on the National Mall displaying over 200,000 signed commitment cards from teenagers pledging to wait until marriage.
That is massive.
Then, in 1997, Joshua Harris published his book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which essentially became the defining manifesto for this movement. It completely altered how millions of teenagers viewed courtship and relationships.
It's interesting to see the political intersection detailed in the research here, too, because the dissertation notes that in 1996, the welfare reform law allocated $50 million a year to abstinence, only until marriage sex education, often abbreviated as AOUM.
50 million.
Yeah. So we see these religious teachings suddenly getting massive federal funding and being powerfully reinforced by school curriculums across the country.
And with that level of institutional and financial backing, the culture developed intense, highly visible rituals to enforce its teachings. The most recognizable, of course, being the purity ring.
Yeah, I remember those.
It served as an outward, physical symbol of an internal pledge. But the research also delves heavily into the phenomenon of purity balls.
The purity balls represent a major shift in how autonomy was viewed. The dissertation details these as highly gendered events, essentially formal dances where fathers would pledge before God to protect their daughter's purity. The language used in these ceremonies effectively treated the daughter's virginity as something the father oversees and guards until he literally hands it off to a husband at the altar.
The psychological framing there establishes a patriarchal dynamic where a young woman's bodily autonomy is not her own.
No.
It is held in trust by the men in her life. She is positioned as a passive vessel rather than an active participant in her own life choices. And this framing was supported by the analogies taught to youth in these programs, analogies that the dissertation interviews uncovered in visceral detail.
Visceral really is the only word for it. They were teaching these teenagers entirely through fear-based objectification. Participants in this study recalled being taught the licked cupcake frosting analogy.
This one is rough.
It is. A teacher would lick the frosting off a cupcake or chew a piece of gum and then offer it to the class asking, "Who would want you now?" The lesson was explicitly clear. If you engaged in physical intimacy before marriage, you were the chewed gum. You were damaged goods, permanently devalued.
We also see the carriage analogy, which is particularly revealing about how they view the danger of physical intimacy. Youth were asked to imagine driving a carriage holding a queen along a mountain road. On one side is the solid mountain, on the other is a deadly cliff.
The cliff being the danger.
Right. The lesson was that you drive the carriage as close to the mountain as possible. In this metaphor, holding hands is hugging the mountain and sex is falling off the cliff. It instilled a terrifying, absolute binary. There is no safe exploration. There's only a constant state of mortal peril where even the slightest misstep puts you on the edge of complete destruction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The UT Austin dissertation didn't just collect these analogies, it actually ran a quantitative study. They surveyed 315 cisgender women to see exactly how these teachings impacted them on a measurable scale.
The researcher utilized a framework called the theory of gender and power, which provides a brilliant lens for this context. It looks at three main pillars. First is the sexual division of labor, which examines gender norms like who is expected to do what. Second is the sexual division of power, which looks at relationship norms, who holds the authority and decision-making power. And the third pillar is something called cathexis.
Let's pause on cathexis because it sounds like heavy academic jargon, but it's actually a crucial concept for understanding this data. Think of it as the emotional glue between two totally different things. In this case, the culture glued a woman's social value directly to her religious devotion. If you break a social rule about dating, you aren't just making a mistake, you are breaking a religious covenant. Your worth and your faith are fused together.
And that fusion is what makes the researchers' initial hypothesis so logical. Going into the study, the assumption was if you hold high purity culture beliefs, you will naturally experience higher levels of sexual shame.
It seems obvious.
It does. But the quantitative results revealed a massive twist. The data showed no direct relationship between purity culture beliefs and sexual shame.
Which creates a fascinating paradox. How could a culture built on the fear of being chewed gum not directly result in measurable shame for these 315 women?
This is why the theory of gender and power framework was so important, because it revealed the missing link, religiosity. The relationship between purity culture and shame was actually mediated by how religious the person currently was. In this specific group of surveyed women, those who still held high purity culture beliefs and had high religiosity actually experienced lower sexual shame.
This data is a masterclass in how echo chambers work. If you are surrounded by a community that constantly validates your sacrifices, your brain doesn't register the restriction as shame, it registers it as righteousness. The pain only hits when that external validation is removed or when the context changes.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at a massive caveat in the data. The average score for purity culture beliefs across the entire study group was actually quite low. What that tells us is that a vast majority of the women taking this survey had already left the purity culture movement.
Ah.
For the small groups still deeply embedded in the religious structure, the system was working as designed. They felt aligned with their faith and didn't report shame. But for everyone else who had stepped outside of that structure, the qualitative data, the actual human interviews, tells a vastly different and much more painful story.
And that brings us to study 2 of the dissertation. Out of the 27 women the researcher sat down and interviewed, a staggering 100% of them reported negative experiences and sexual shame tied to their upbringing in purity culture.
100%.
Every single one.
This is where we see the concept of whiplash come into play. These women described a psychological whiplash that is hard to overstate. For their entire adolescence, they were taught to suppress their sexuality entirely. One participant literally described being taught to exist as a sexless blob.
Wow.
But the moment they got married, the script flipped overnight. Suddenly, they were expected to be highly sexual, uninhibited partners. Furthermore, they were subtly taught that they were responsible for satisfying their husband's needs so the men wouldn't be tempted to stray.
It's an impossible, contradictory standard. The interviews are full of real stories of the trauma this caused, perfectly echoing Candace's experience of not being able to flip the switch. One woman shared how she actually had a panic attack on her wedding night.
Heartbreaking.
She and her husband had waited, they did everything right according to the rules, but her body had so deeply internalized the message that sex was a deadly cliff, she couldn't physically process that it was suddenly allowed just because she was wearing a ring. Her brain knew she was married, but her nervous system was sounding alarms, treating intimacy as a threat.
The trauma didn't just affect heterosexual marriages either. The research included a woman in a same-sex relationship who shared a deeply insightful realization. She realized that both she and her female partner had been so heavily socialized by purity culture to please the other, to be the caretaker of someone else's sexual needs rather than experiencing their own, that when they were intimate, neither of them was actually present in the moment.
They were just performing.
They were both just performing the caretaker role they'd been conditioned to play, completely detached from their own bodily sensations.
The study also highlights the devastating feeling expressed by women who had consensual sex before marriage. The interviews showed they carried this heavy, agonizing feeling of being damaged goods, or that they were merely practice for the men they were with. Because the messaging was so heavily skewed toward preserving female innocence as the ultimate currency of worth, they felt permanently broken once that currency was spent.
It's a heavy burden to carry.
So what does this all mean? How do you move forward when your foundational understanding of intimacy and your own body is built on fear and objectification?
For the women in this study, the answer lies in a demanding, deliberate process called deconstruction. Deconstruction is the systematic dissecting and rejecting of the belief systems you grew up with. It's essentially taking the house down to the studs and evaluating every single plank before deciding what to rebuild. The study noted that out of the 27 women interviewed, 20 had fully deconstructed their purity culture beliefs, and the remaining 7 were actively in the process of doing so.
And what the research makes abundantly clear is that this is not a journey they can navigate alone simply by deciding to think differently. Therapy emerged as an absolute lifeline for these women. It provided a safe, neutral space to do the grueling work of untangling their inherent self-worth from their sexual history. Think about what that entails. They had to use therapy to learn the absolute basics of human connection that they were denied in their youth. We are talking about establishing personal boundaries, realizing that saying no isn't a sin, and understanding true bodily autonomy.
Exactly. Reclaiming bodily autonomy means unlearning the idea that your body belongs to your father, your husband, or your community, and realizing it belongs solely to you. It's a massive psychological milestone. The therapy process involves identifying those moments where the nervous system sounds a false alarm and gently retraining the brain to understand that the environment is safe. It is the arduous work of airing out that unseen gas leak that Madison Prewitt-Trout was talking about on Candace's podcast.
You don't realize you're breathing it in until you try to function in a healthy adult relationship and find that you simply can't. The deconstruction process is about opening all the windows, acknowledging the toxic air you've been breathing, and slowly learning how to breathe cleanly again.
Which is exactly why this topic is so vital for you to understand, even if you didn't grow up anywhere near purity culture or the evangelical church. Because what this research proves unequivocally is how profoundly the invisible scripts we are handed in our youth wire our adult neurobiology. The messages you absorb from your parents, your schools, your media, they literally shape your nervous system. This deep dive shows us that intimacy isn't just a physical act, it's a deeply psychological one. And when that psychology is rooted in shame, unlearning it isn't something that happens by accident or simply by getting older. It is a deliberate, active, and often painful process of rewiring your brain and taking ownership of your own story.
It's a powerful reminder that our reactions to things, even something as simple as a photo on Instagram, are often fueled by decades of quiet conditioning.
This raises an important question. We've spent this entire deep dive looking backward, examining how a highly religious movement in the 1990s used fear, shame, and rigid rules to dictate bodily autonomy and self-worth. But I want you to look around at our secular modern culture today. Think about the intense, crushing pressures around physical perfection and anti-aging.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the pervasive, often contradictory expectations of modern hookup culture, or the relentless pursuit of social media validation where your worth is tied to engagement metrics. How might the broader secular messages that we all passively consume today be quietly dictating our own bodily autonomy and our own self-worth in ways that are just as rigid and just as hidden as the purity pledges of the 1990s?